Pinky.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Nick. Hi, Flavio.
Hey, Kara.
Here, so are you going to send me your edited version of our paper? Is that how it's going to work?
Yeah, so I've been going, yours is the one I've done the most editing for. And then I was actually wondering, so at the moment I've just added comments. And so I wanted to talk through with everyone about whether they agree with my suggested sort of shift in structure and in the more overarching challenge themes. So the policy paper that I sent around kind of gives, I think, a good idea of the structure that we're aiming for. And so I was trying to look at doing that for what you guys have produced.
So at the moment, the structure is there's an introduction by Sean, and then there's the stuff on epi-economic modeling, and then there's the cost-benefit stuff, and then there's the stuff on preparedness, and that's it, right?
Yeah, and so I think so. Like with the cost-benefit stuff, I think that the kind of background bit about sort of the bit at the beginning where you kind of lay out what cost benefit analysis is and like the structure of it, I'm not sure that we necessarily need all of that, and maybe some bits of that could go in the introduction. So I see it more as like what you'd put down is like challenge 1, determining and quantifying costs, and then you could like start at the very beginning, like having just literally a paragraph of saying health economists normally do sort of that cost benefit analysis. That's kind of a standard thing in health economics. But no,
not in health economics, no. In environmental economics, it is. But health economists mainly do cost effectiveness stuff because they don't like putting monetary values on benefits.
Okay.
So let's stay away from health economists.
So okay. Because what I was wondering whether the big challenge here. So I guess I was just thinking that normally in stuff I've seen, like when they do vaccination programs and stuff, they essentially are running a model forwards. They look at how many lives you'd save by doing your vaccination program. They assign a QALY to each of those people, and then they work out what the cost of that vaccination program, say, is. But I was wondering, so that, and I thought is that not a cost? Not quite okay.
We don't even talk about that. So that's cost effectiveness analysis, and we haven't talked about that at all in what we've written. We've been talking about cost benefit analysis.
What's the difference?
So the difference is in cost effectiveness analysis, the only thing you're monetizing is the cost of achieving a given objective. And what you're trying to do is kind of minimize the cost of achieving that objective. So you just say, okay, if we do it this way, it's going to cost us 3 million. If we're going to do it that way, it's going to cost us 6 million. But you don't say, is this objective a good objective? Whereas in cost benefit analysis, you're monetizing the benefits, and you're not starting from a presumption that you're going to do something or anything actually. You're just looking at the benefits minus the costs of lots of different options. So historically in the UK anyway, Department of Health has totally veered away from doing cost benefit analysis because they don't like the idea of putting a monetary value on the health benefits. Whereas the Department of Transport is very happy to do cost benefit analysis, including where the main benefit is avoided deaths. So, and in environmental policy, we do cost benefit analysis. So what Sean and I have written is about cost benefit analysis. It's nothing to do with cost effectiveness analysis.
Okay, so I guess I was thinking that some of the health economists might sort of say, well, we do I think then we need to talk about a bit more the state of play of the current state of play, which is cost effectiveness analysis.
Well, that depends. I'm not sure that's true,
Yeah.
Kira. I mean, that might be true if you were talking to a room full of health economists. They'd say, well, that's what we do. But that's not who we are, and that's not who we're talking to either, is it?
No, but I think, like, hopping in here, Nick, I think Kira's point is just to point out that is what health economists do. Like,
Yeah.
that is the bulk of health economics is not benefit cost analysis, it's cost effectiveness analysis. And it's actually not even like that's what it is. And I spent like 2 weeks or a week calling a bunch of health economists and asking them, like, what's the elasticity of patient survival with respect to hospital staffing? And nobody could answer that. And I'm like, this is what you guys do. And they all said, yeah, this is what we should be doing. But what we actually do is like the elasticity of hospital revenues with hospital staffing. And so I mean, Kira, is that your point basically? Is there needs to be like a sentence or two at the beginning that the bulk of health economics is cost effectiveness?
Yes, yeah. And I guess what I'm sort of saying is that the advantage, if I've understood right, Nick, the advantage of doing cost benefit analysis over cost effectiveness analysis is that cost benefit isn't sort of, would it be right in saying like it's not scenario driven? You haven't got like
no, I think that the difference is, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Nick has said, but I think in a sense, one way you can think about the difference is that actually what animates cost benefit analysis is just a belief that if you can improve the efficiency of outcomes, then that's what matters. And that's all. So nothing beyond that. Whereas in cost effectiveness analysis, you've had some prior antecedently given, exogenously given decision about what the objectives are. So it's not efficiency anymore. It's just like it should be, you save lives. And so, for example, I think that I've only just listened to the Reith lecture actually, but plainly that's what Carney thought should have been done. Is it should have been, you should have just set up lives as the objective here, save lives, and then it was a question about what the cost-effective way of saving life was. So no trade-off or no consideration about some people might value life more than others. It's you antecedently set the objective and then decided on how.
But if you do cost-benefit analysis, don't you implicitly also do a cost-effectiveness one?
Of course, but the difference is that the
no,
only
I understand. I understand.
The only objective is efficiency.
So the effect, sure, that's just the cost minimization part of the cost-benefit analysis. And then you basically trace out the frontier and figure out which one is the most preferred one, given that you're minimizing the costs for each objective.
Absolutely, but the difference is that through cost-benefit analysis, you reveal, as it were, the value of the objectives that people actually hold.
Sure.
Whereas when it's cost-effectiveness of the kind that the distinction is being made here is, you do none of that on the sort of, you take the objective as somehow being determined through some other process.
Sure.
Yeah, but the key point,
the difference is the bounds of the system. That's really what it comes down to. It's how do you bound the system? And benefit cost analysis has generally a broader bound, but even there, we often set arbitrary bounds on, what benefits count and what benefits don't count, or benefits to whom, right?
Yeah.
Right. You could do a benefit cost analysis on the UK's COVID response, and it could lead to a different strategy than if you did a benefit cost analysis on like Europe and the UK's response, or a global response, right? And so that really, I think this is what Flavio is saying, is the difference between cost effectiveness analysis and benefit cost analysis is how we think about setting those boundaries. And in benefit cost analysis, we tend to think about who and what benefits count, where in cost effectiveness analysis, as you said, Sean, it's like, hit this target, right? It has nothing to do with, is that a worthwhile target or not?
Yeah, exactly. It's antecedently given to the whole exercise.
The other key point here is we haven't, when I say we, Sean and I haven't written any of our stuff as if we were writing about cost effectiveness analysis, because well, that's not what we did. So we'd have to start again, and we're not doing that.
No. Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to pull out of. So I feel like all the sections at the moment, there's like each one has sort of two bits to it. There's one bit where it's kind of saying a bit about the background of an of an economic technique, and then like the challenges of using that economic technique. And I guess what I'm trying to what the challenges papers typically I think was wanted to be was more, here are some challenges. So I guess what I'm trying to pick out is what are some of the challenges that we're currently facing that maybe the things like cost benefit analysis would go some way to fixing, but they in themselves have their own challenges. So that would be like the overarching big challenge. And
so
then
I think the overarching big challenge here is it's defining the scope of the system. And that's where you're getting this difference between benefit cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis. Is if, you could do a cost effective analysis is like, what's the least cost way to vaccinate 80% of your population, right? Where vaccinating 80% of your population is taken as the goal, right? But it might be that might be the wrong goal. And so if you change the objective to like, what's the way that you maximize the expected lifetime earnings of your population, it could be that you want to vaccinate, 76% instead of 80%, and you're going to do something else. So basically benefit cost analysis generally relative to cost effective analysis generally gives you more levers, and it expands the scope of the system. And I think that this is one of the big things that I'm hearing in the US, and I think it's also happening in the UK, which is that we understand that our approach to epidemiological, what COVID has exposed is our approach to epidemiological modeling is it ties into so many other facets of life in society that doing a simple cost effectiveness analysis on like how to save the most lives even might not be the right objective, right? If you can save the most lives at least cost, but it leads to lots and lots of child abuse, we might be willing to like sacrifice a few more lives if we have a way of making trade-offs between child abuse and death.
But do you think that's because, so I feel like, and it's kind of touched upon in that the CBA, the cost benefit analysis section focuses on non-pharmaceutical interventions. And in that, this is probably the first time ever in history that non-pharmaceutical interventions have been the main way in which we've had to deal or manage the disease. Whereas normally, like when any other big campaigns that public health officials will be trying to do a cost effectiveness analysis on would be something more like a vaccination program or a treatment program, where you aren't going to have all these sort of indirect costs from what you're doing in terms of, rolling out a vaccine wouldn't necessarily have an indirect cost to other individuals, like in the way a lockdown would.
What about HIV though? That would contradict your thesis. I mean, that's a big one where there was no treatment, no vaccine, and all the measures were NPIs initially.
Yeah, I agree with Valerie that there's been a lot of non-pharmaceutical intervention through, the plague, even H1N1, there were big lockdowns in Mexico City. So it's certainly happened before, but I don't think at the society-wide scale. Because of the way HIV worked, people could sort of opt out of being in high-risk groups, right? And so, but I think the preamble to what Kira just said is kind of irrelevant. I think what she said after the first sentence was exactly right. And I think it's this confusion of, like the example that my wife often gives is like they want, her boss will say like optimize the system for 100% on time arrival. And like her response is always, well, if we had 95% on time arrival and our profitability went up, why not just suffer 5% of our customers being upset with us once in a while? 5% of our customers upset that they're late, but if our profitability goes up by 20%, that seems like a better measure. Like we should be maximizing profit, not minimizing on-time arrivals. And that's the difference between benefit cost analysis and cost effectiveness analysis.
So is that why? Oh, sorry, Sean. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry, perhaps I misunderstood though what you were saying in the remark before this, which was more about, as it were, that you would like us to bring out exactly what the challenges were more explicitly. And
yeah, I think the bigger arching challenges, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I think the way we've tended to think about it is trying to identify what challenges are for future pandemics, and those challenges might be the subject of research programs, you know, PhD theses or whatever. Sort of the big, as Kira said, the sort of overarching challenges. Now, obviously, a lot of it comes out of where we are now, and in some of the areas, and I don't know whether this applies in the economics area or not, but it might, is that one of the challenges is that there's methodology out there in various fields which could be used and isn't being used at the moment in epidemiology. And so there's the question of challenges to make sure that these methods are implemented, which is different from developing new methodology. You know, it's already there. And as I say, I don't know whether that applies in this instance, but it might a bit. So it's a sort of mixture of things.
Yeah,
but I suppose I see the headline challenges in that sense is the challenges about knowing what the effects of any intervention actually are. And that in this particular case is all about how you sensibly integrate economic and epidemiological models, and of which there are a number of then problems that fall out of that attempt to integrate them. But it's a challenge to know what the actual effect of any intervention is going to be, given that it involves a complex interaction between the epidemiology of it and the economic effects of it. And then I think the other headline challenge is when we're dealing with such major policy interventions, it's a question about how you assess them, evaluate them, and that I think is, broadly speaking, is the two parts of the paper as it now stands.
Yeah.
But within each nested a variety of distinguishable other sort of subheadings for the challenges. But it seems to me that that's the headline issue is that.
I agree, Sean. I think that the issue here is also like where in the process these techniques belong. So benefit cost analysis is sort of the research, like this is, you would do benefit cost analysis and trying to address the issues Sean's talking about as you're giving advice to Parliament or the executives. You do cost effective analysis when your department has already gotten a budget and a legislative target that they're told to meet. Right. And so, I mean, and so it's not that one's better, it's just, and so I think the problem is we've been, if you look at a lot of the early COVID work, while it was very good at, it actually wasn't bad. I mean, you could certainly be upset with it, but it wasn't bad at getting qualitatively what was going to happen, approximately right. But when it did things like, well, let's assume transmission falls by 50% when we do a lockdown, it misses all of those interactions of behavior. And so you really can't know what's going to happen. I mean, other than qualitatively, yes, if there's, if you break up the network, information flows less quickly over it and you get less transmission. So what, right? This is like the paper we wrote in the Lancet, right? It's like nobody had it was amazing how many people hadn't bothered to stop to think that if you close schools, even if it breaks up transmission substantially, it could keep your healthcare workers home, right? So the people who get sick wind up dying at sufficiently higher rates that you actually don't prevent deaths. And so I think, these are the sorts of connections that I think Sean's talking about that need to feed into, the leadership strategy. But when it gets to like the National Health Service, they're given a budget and they're given a target and they want to do cost effectiveness analysis. Like it's sort of, that's the incentive that they have. They're not in a position at that point necessarily to say, actually, this is the wrong objective. I mean, there probably are channels for them to feedback, but there's this issue between setting objectives and carrying out objectives. And I think that's where some of the tension is.
And I think there is then an overlap with the policy paper, which is why Lisa's here, because she's working on the policy paper in that. And as Flavia will know from just speaking to some of the modelers on SPI-M, I think there's been a slight push from government side to make sure that the epidemiology is kept separate from the economics. So I think I believe they presented some work which incorporated economics into SPI-M, and it was ignored, and they were asked not to take it further. So, and that's kind of coming from on high, from like the Treasury being like, this is what we deal with, we just want your scientific evidence. And so if they're being asked very specific questions, so I guess I was thinking, Sean, of, you know, the bit in the cost benefit analysis bit that you guys wrote about the imperial model and how they put it up against as suppression or mitigation, and they never considered elimination. And I wonder if that's because what they were asked was, you know, what happens if we do nothing, and at what point will the health service reach maximum capacity? They weren't asked, what should we do to over the next 5 years mean that this disease causes the least amount of impact? And if they'd been asked that question, they probably would have come up with a different answer, I guess. So it's kind of the questions in which they are being asked by the policymakers as well.
I agree, but that seems to me to be, as it were, not our problem. That I do genuinely think is, as it were, the interface with policymakers problem is, and I quite see that entirely, that as it were, these are challenges for anybody who deals with the policy-making world at the front end. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, and I think our historical experience with H1N1, with HIV in the UK, in the US, they probably did not have noticeable general equilibrium effects or noticeable long-term sort of macroeconomic effects. There were little blips here and there. I don't think this is true for countries like South Africa, but COVID has basically had a general equilibrium, you know, it's like, there's no way of denying the general equilibrium effects of COVID-19 and the policy responses of COVID-19. And so to understand these trade-offs, like, it's a first order problem where it wasn't a first order problem for H1N1.
I agree entirely. And I mean, even if this is the policy push that's coming from the Treasury, I mean, I think it should be resisted, because it can only lead you astray. You know, when there are important interconnections, you decide to ignore them, and you come undone.
But I guess the problem is, so SPI-M is actually a subsidiary of the Department of Health, and so they ask certain prominent scientists to come and sit on their board. So they're not going to ask economists or people who work at that epi-econ interface. They'll just be asking the pure epidemiologists. Like, I wonder if this is kind of what happened. Whereas if you had and so the epidemiologists, I think it was just that they were feeling that from what was coming out in the public, that it was clear that there is this interaction with economics and epidemiology, and they themselves realized that they were clearly missing a large part, that they weren't experts in that field. So there is maybe a challenge there of, you know, when you're sort of the economics needs to be kind of included always from that very beginning in epidemiology. The two are kind of interlinked when you're thinking about it from a perspective of informing policy.
Absolutely, I agree entirely. But in a certain sense, and obviously, you know, it depends upon the nature of the problem you're trying to address as to whether you worry about these interactions deeply or not. But I think in a way, if we talk about that kind of thing, aren't we trespassing on whatever the policy making is doing? Because isn't the policy making paper going to be talking about precisely those, as it were, you might say, bureaucratic inflexibilities with respect to the way that they've treated with previous problems of one kind or another, which might have been suited for those, but have proved to be ill-suited for actually policy making for something like COVID-19?
It's kind of like the conundrum, Kira, some years ago on why do governments ignore economists when it comes to designing environmental policy? And some of us wrote some papers on that. And one of the reasons was that, well, Wilfred Beckerman, who was a very famous Oxford economist, said basically that governments were too stupid to understand what economists were talking about, which didn't make him very popular. But I think a more logical explanation was the criteria that economists thought were really important were not criteria that environmental regulators or governments thought were important until there was a real crunch point between environmental control and unemployment. And then suddenly people got interested. But anyway, that was apropos of nothing. Sorry about that.
I mean, there's also
Okay.
I mean, there's also just the history here, right? And so Anderson and May were basically physicists, ecologists. And so when I've talked to my colleagues in public health who are not epi-modelers, they criticize the epi-modelers for not including some of the social behavioral sciences. The epi-modeling history comes out of a very physics-driven physics, ecology, natural science view of the world. But an epidemic is fundamentally a social phenomenon, right? It's about the connections among people and why they make those connections and how they'll change those connections. And so it's a bit of the way that we've defined mathematical epidemiology is as much the problem. And, you know, Bob May famously wrote a paper a few years ago where he said he had an ecological model that explained the banking collapse of 2009. It wasn't published in an econ journal. It's pretty laughable what he says to an economist, but like this, there's like, it's working with math epi people for years. I have been asked many times, well, can't we just turn behavior off? Like, why is like, it's considered a second order part of the problem. And, you know, especially if your primary tool is trying to get people to change their behavior, you damn well better need a place in your model that's something other than cranking a parameter up and down. And like, that's the heart of the problem. Is my hunch is that SPI-M went to present economic, you know, if they brought up economics, Treasury looked at them and said, so where are the economists, right? Like, why are you doing this with a bunch of math epi people who don't understand economics? I mean, that's my hunch of sort of trying to channel the people, at least I know in the Treasury, right? That's what they would say is like, yeah, it's important, but you guys don't know what you're talking about. And believe me, most of the time, the math epi people I've worked with don't know anything about economics. And they don't want to think about behavior. What they want to do, I spent years like, what we should be doing is making people be more pro-social. Can't we just rely on pro-social tendencies? And, you know, we'll change people's opinions and we can educate them because they're stupid, right? And that's kind of the attitude I've gotten from a lot of math epi modelers when I've started working with them. And so it doesn't surprise me that people in the Treasury would be skeptical of economics done by that group of people. That's certainly been the attitude of the Imperial Ecology crowd every time I've come in contact with them. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry if I'm dishing about like personal relationships, but
no, I do see your point, and I mean, I think it's like a multifaceted problem, but I am aware we are getting close to 4:30. And one thing I did want to raise with you guys is, so Matt Keeling and Mike Tildesley, who are both on SPI-M, they've written a draft of a paper about trying to sort of start they appreciate they're not economists. They don't think it's their first attempt, and they have really struggled to engage with economists. So they contacted some economists at Warwick and they got very poor response, but they are very eager to try and engage more with the economics community. And so I suggested that they come along to this meeting in a couple of weeks' time, if everyone's happy with that. They're going to come at 4:30.
So let's just say a few words about the background. So there's this new thing called Juniper that Kira is spearheading.
No, I'm not spearheading. So Julia and Matt are the leads, and I'm just the support.
I think you're being humble. You're the figurehead.
So they're leading it. That's actually, should I just give a quick background about what's Juniper is? so SPI-M is at the moment really consists of Imperial and LSHTM, and then there are a lot of really small modelling groups who've been doing an awful lot of the work. So the Juniper Consortium is trying to bring together all of those smaller groups. So that's Warwick, Bristol, Exeter, Oxford, Cambridge, Lancaster and Manchester. And Julia Gogg and Matt Keeling are leading.
Right. So okay. So I spent basically a good chunk of my time over the last year trying to engage with people on SPI-M. Several of the people that were mentioned in this previous few sentences are on there. And in the past, they've engaged a lot with me in all sorts of contexts. But since the epidemic started, none of them have. And so, you know, I've basically felt a bit like slamming my head against the wall, not getting anywhere with the epi people. And at the same time, also talking to people in the Treasury, trying to, you know, convince them that they really need to talk to epidemiologists. So I've been pretty pissed off, to be honest. And so there was a meeting of Juniper the other day where they were talking about all the nice things they wanted to do and so on. And of course, you know, economics or behavior was nowhere to be found. And so that I found that to be the perfect opportunity for a little rant. And where I gave them a piece of my mind, but yeah, I'm not so sure it came across as inviting as it should have. But it did actually prompt 3 of them to email me, you know, to say we would like to engage. And so we had a meeting an hour and a half ago, where I kind of laid out the case of why they should listen to people like us, that we are not trying to imperialize their discipline, that we can actually help, maybe help them think through some of the things that they want to do. And also we might offer them some of the things we think are our strengths. So I presented that as maybe an opportunity for us to start a conversation in some kind of way. And so the first attempt to do that would be this, you know, about their specific project they're doing, but I hope that we will be able going forward to do something much broader than just that one project. So that, yeah.
Here, I would think that, I mean, that sounds great, but I very much doubt that in one meeting you can both communicate effectively with these epidemiologists and sort out the paper.
No, exactly. No, that's exactly the point.
So
this, yeah, sorry.
The first half hour we'll try and continue. So I think really the ball is in my court still, and I'm sorry, schools start back next week, so hopefully, so I think Michael will get because also we had the Juniper launch meeting last week and the UKRI announcement all in the same week. So I have already started editing that. I've gone through all the sections and I'm starting, and this has been really helpful for me to, because I was a bit stuck on trying to pull out the bigger themes, and I'm not an economist, so I still struggle with some of the language, but so this has been helpful. And I think the best thing for me to do would be for me to edit all of each of the documents and then send it back to you guys to see what you think. Yes, Nick.
But one really, really important thing for you to do, Kira, is stitch it all together. So there's just one document. Yes,
that's what I was going to do. Yeah, so that's why I was trying to pull out what the broad arching challenges are, because I still think that there are parts of each of the sections that should more be in an introduction than actually possibly. But so that was what I thought I'd do next week, and then in 2 weeks' time, if we can then discuss, the first half an hour is going to suggest we discuss that, and then they're going to join at 4:30. If you can't stay, that's fine, but that's
2 weeks from now.
Yeah.
And do we have this hard deadline for the paper, Kira? Is that still in place, as it were?
The very hard deadline is the end of April.
Oh, okay.
The dream deadline is the end of March.
Okay.
But that's
the submission rather than having gone out for, internal review and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So we've given the soft deadline of the end of March because we thought a lot of people might not make the end of March, and in our minds have the hard deadline of the end of April.
Yeah, we understand these things.
So,
but now we've given away all
our secrets. But so I think as long as we're in 2 weeks' time reading through, a full draft in the way that the policy paper is, where it's all been put together, then I think that's a good stage to be in.
Can I just, if you start, remember that we have at 5 o'clock, we have the other meeting. So if you were expecting to go on more than half an hour, we need to make some arrangements about different.
It's okay, Valerie. Yeah, I'll set up a different link for this meeting,
Yeah.
and then that way there's the
That'll
opportunity.
be fine. Yeah,
That's a good point. Thank you for pointing it out to me.
This is on the 18th, Kira. I thought we were
Yeah.
meeting on the 25th and the 11th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's because you moved this last week to
Yeah.
this week. So if you go back to the previous schedule, it would be the 11th and the 25th. So it's a question of what.
So it's
So we're picking up sort of every 2 weeks from now, and so the next one would be on the
Yeah.
18th.
Can I ask just a very important administrative question? Can somebody be like Kira, dogged about updating the calendar invites? Because not only is this getting confusing because we're moving meetings around, we're about to go through daylight savings time, and the UK and the US don't do daylight savings on the same day. And so when even just talking about times, it's going to be completely messed up unless we let like Microsoft handle all the time conversions.
Yeah.
So please.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I've put out.
And sorry, Kira, one last question from me. So when do we send it to Roland? KO for comments. Or is that still the plan?
Yes. Well, so I would quite like, so Petra, I think might be a really good person to send it to. And we can send it to Roland as well. But Petra Klepak, she's only not come because she's actually on maternity leave at the moment. But I think she would really like to read through the paper, and she, I think, would have some interesting insights and comments. So I was hoping to send it to her next week.
As soon as you've got a combined single document, but you can send it to Roland as well, and one or two others. Anybody that you all think would be useful. I mean, with Lisa's policy paper, it went out to what, half a dozen or so, I should think. Was that?
So
Yeah.
one person who I do think could be really helpful if she's got time is Eleanor Murray at Boston University. And I just put an article that she wrote in Journal of Economic Perspectives in the chat window. If you guys haven't seen this, she's great, but she is a public health epi modeling person. She comes out of public health, but thinks a lot about behavior and causality, and thinks a lot like an economist. And she must have some economics training somewhere. But she published a paper in the fall in Journal of Economic Perspectives, and the title is Epidemiology's Time of Need. COVID-19 calls for epidemic-related economics, right? And so this is like, she would be a good person, I think, to read if we're like answering this call in this paper, perhaps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Looks good.
So it just, sorry. I don't know if she has time to do this or not, but.
Yeah, no.
She spends about 14 hours a day on Twitter. So I'm sure she can find time to read.
I don't know. I think she writes Twitter papers. I think she's one of these people who's like writing papers on Twitter.
No, I saw she wrote a Twitter thread saying the things she had been engaged with during the last year. There were like 25 different papers. So I thought, man, that is completely crazy. But I mean, they're big teams, of course. So it's not a full-time commitment on each paper, but it was just astonishing how much she's done. No, I think she's quite a public figure in that space. I did read the paper when it came out. I remember I was left with a feeling that it was good that they were engaging, but also she had a very skewed perspective of what economists actually do.
No, she's much more in sort of micro IO causality view of economics than a lot of the things we're talking about.
But yeah, no, sure, it's a good place to start. Okay.
Cool. So I will update the Outlook calendars invites, and I will go through this, and then I'll send it to Roland and Petra, and then next in 2 weeks' time we can sort of reconvene as to how we think we're going with the draft and getting their comments.
Does Lisa have a voice?
Yes, sorry. Kara invited me along just to listen in. So I'm leading on the policy paper, but we don't have any economists in the group, so I thought it'd be useful to kind of reach out and listen in to sort of what discussions you're having, and I'm sure I can chat with Kara after about sort of specifically what you feel are the challenges. Yeah, just so it just try to be a bit more representative.
But one of the good things about having Lisa here, and so I mean, we're trying to sort of have people who are involved in several papers, because then you know you can get the cross-referencing working well, and we hope there'll be quite a bit of that. So
well, I think it's super important to that the economics and the policy are well integrated, because you know it's very common for economists to write, this is my model and these are the policy implications, and then not think much about whether you can actually implement them and all this kind of stuff. So I think that is important. Yeah. No, sorry to put you on the spot. I hadn't heard your voice at all. Okay.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I don't want to take up any more of your time, but thank you very much. This was really useful for me. And see you all in 2 weeks.
Okay, see you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Okay, ciao, bye.